The claim that Jesus rose from the dead is central to Christianity. It's not only central, but all of Christianity, the Christian faith, kind of hangs on this idea that Jesus really lived, he really died, and he really rose from the dead. In the Bible, in the book of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul actually says that if Jesus was not really raised, then all of Christianity is basically worthless. We're wasting our time because it's all, the whole movement, the whole Christian belief system is based and centered around this claim that Jesus really rose from the dead. And so knowing whether or not he actually rose from the dead is key to understanding Christianity. If you could show that Jesus did not live or did not die or did not rise from the dead, this would cause major problems for Christianity. Now, Christians have long claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. The Christian claims, if you look in the Gospels are the 4 biographies of Jesus, and different scholars will date them, but typically within the first century, so somewhere within the first 60 to 70 years following Jesus, the Gospels are written. And they claim that Jesus, was a real guy. He lived and he was crucified. And that after he died, one of the Jewish leaders of the time, who had been kind of secretly sympathetic to Jesus, he took Jesus' body and he buried him in a tomb that he had access to. And that Jesus' body was placed in this tomb, and then 3 days later, a group of women came to the tomb, and they find the stone that had been covering the entrance to the tomb, they find it moved, and they find Jesus is not there. The body is gone from the tomb. In fact, they also claim that angels appear to them and say that Jesus has risen, and then they go tell the disciples this, and now all of a sudden Jesus appears and he shows them that he's resurrected. This is the claim of Christianity. Now, there's a number of key points in that story that we might look at to see, are these things true? But today I want to look at the claim that the women found the tomb empty, or that the tomb itself was empty to begin with. Do we have any reason to think that the tomb was empty? If the tomb was not empty, if the disciples started going around, here's Jesus' followers, he dies, Jesus' followers start going around and they start telling people, our leader came back from the dead. If Jesus' body was still in the tomb, it would be pretty easy to cut this early Christian movement off at the knees and say, no, he didn't raise from the dead. Look, here is still his tomb. Here is still his body. Now, in a lot of religious movements, you might see some diehard people who will believe no matter what happens. You could show them the body of Jesus and they'd still believe that he rose from the dead. There might always be some diehards, but if you could show them the body of Jesus, the majority of the Christians are probably not going to be too keen on continuing with this Christian movement. The Christians in the early days following Jesus faced pretty significant persecution already. And the idea is that they're willing to face persecution because they think what they believe is true. But if it's not true, why face the persecution? It would be pretty easy if you were the Jewish or Roman leaders and you wanted to get rid of this Christian movement to simply produce the body of Jesus. But if the tomb is empty, now this lends a lot of credence to these Christians who are claiming that, the tomb is empty because Jesus came back to life and left. That's why his body's not there. So do we have any good reasons to think that the tomb of Jesus was empty? Well, we do see the early story of Jesus that's in the Gospels. Now, the Gospels appear in that first century, so the first 60, 70 years after Jesus dies, the Gospel accounts are written. The dating of the books is going to differ by scholar, but let's just use 60 to 70 as like a good little middle ground. Within that time, the story appears that Jesus rose from the dead and that his tomb is empty. Now, this is actually, in and of itself, pretty close to the time of Jesus. Now, if you dug up a body that was buried 60 years, you probably wouldn't recognize Jesus from his facial features, but the Gospels say that Jesus was buried in a known part of town, in a tomb that was not only known to his followers, but belonged to a prominent Jewish leader. So identifying which tomb would not be difficult, even 50, 60 years later. And if you went there and you found a body that was at least, the remains of the body show that it's in Jesus' tomb and it's about his right height, I think that alone would be pretty significant evidence that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But this does not happen. We don't see any record of people producing Jesus' body. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew actually responds to another claim that is known to the community at that time. Matthew, when he's writing his gospel, says not only, we know that the tomb was empty because Jesus rose from the dead, but he says, that if you ask the Jewish leaders, they'll tell you that we, the disciples, or at least somebody who is following Jesus, came in the night and stole his body. And that's why it's not that Jesus rose from the dead. Don't believe that nonsense. But the body is missing because somebody stole the body. Now, there's an interesting omission, though, in this theory that's put forth by the Jewish leaders. They're saying the disciples stole the body. Well, it admits, though, that the tomb of Jesus was empty. Why you wouldn't? This theory does not work unless everyone knows the tomb is empty. Now we got to explain it. We're going to offer another explanation for how it's empty. That it doesn't point that Jesus is God, but admits that we're stuck with this hard fact: the tomb of Jesus really is empty. So we know that when Matthew is writing, it's not just that he's claiming that the tomb is empty, but he's responding to another claim that's out there in the community that, yes, the tomb is empty, and here's why. I think that's pretty good evidence because it's essentially responding to an enemy's claim about Jesus. And even the enemy who says Jesus is not God, Jesus didn't really raise from the dead, admits the tomb is empty. If you look at even earlier writings than the Gospels, if you look at one of the earliest, I think the one writing that I think all scholars agree on in terms of the dating is 1 Corinthians. Paul writes 1 Corinthians about 20 years after Jesus dies. Paul, 20 years later, is claiming Jesus rose from the dead. Now, he's claiming that the suggestion, if you say somebody rose from the dead, you would be implying that their tomb is empty. Because if somebody raises from the dead, they're going to leave a hole where they were buried. So I think even 20 years later, we're seeing that the claim is that Jesus' tomb should be empty. And even at that time, we're not seeing any other evidence that would suggest the tomb is not empty. In fact, it seems that everybody is responding. For about the first several hundred years, Christians are constantly responding to the claim that somebody stole Jesus' body, which suggests that the tomb is empty, but they're not responding to any other claims. Like, you don't see early Christians responding to the idea that, oh no, the body is still in the tomb. Even 20 years later, even if the body is decomposed at that time, wouldn't it be worthwhile to just exhume the body, show it around town a little bit, and a lot of these Christians are going to disappear. This Christian movement is going to be totally cut off, and we would not see the enormous success that we see Christianity, that goes from this small fledgling group of people under fierce persecution to being one of the major world religions for the following 2,000 years and continues to be. I think there's one other reason I think we could say that the tomb, it was likely empty, and it's that the story in the gospel indicates that a group of women went to the tomb and found the tomb was empty. Now, I don't want to overstate how prejudiced the first century was, but there were certain prejudices that existed in the first century that would suggest that a woman's word or their testimony wasn't ideal. They would prefer a man's. Now, I think I've heard some people say that you couldn't even provide testimony, a woman couldn't be a witness. I think I think people would hear a woman in the first century, but there's certainly strong sexist prejudices in the first century that would, I think, indicate that the culture at the time would prefer a man report something than a woman. But the gospel writers, they stake their whole claim, when they're writing the story of the Gospels, they stake their whole claim on Jesus being raised from the dead on the idea that women found his tomb empty. I think if you're fabricating the story, given the prejudices, the sexism at the time, it would seem like if you really were trying to convince everyone that Jesus came back from the dead, that you would make up a story where some men found the tomb empty. Then you don't have to overcome sexism or prejudice in the audience. You just say a man saw it, and most people at that day might be more willing to accept it. But instead, the gospel writers indicate that women found the tomb empty. I think that that's pretty good evidence that this is a true story. That the story that the women showed up and the tomb was empty is true. And that's why they wrote it that way. If we were going to fabricate it, there's maybe more cynically beneficial ways to tell the story if you're trying to deceive everyone in the first century than to write it this way. I think that the fact that it is women who find the tomb is a great piece of evidence that would indicate that the tomb was really empty in history. And all of these records appear in the decades following Jesus' death. This is not 100 years later, 200 years later, 1,000 years later, where somebody's making a claim, oh yeah, Jesus rose from the dead, but now who knows where his tomb was, and it's all lost to the cloud of history. It's too murky. No, this is within a short amount of time when Jesus' resting place would be known. The Jewish leaders would be able to disentomb him. I think it would be very easy if the tomb was not empty to show that it wasn't empty. In fact, we see no historical record. There's no evidence that anyone ever made a claim, including all the enemies of Jesus, ever made a claim that his body was still in the tomb. The only claim against Christianity we see early in history is that the tomb's empty, but probably the disciples stole the body. I think there's very good reason to think that the tomb is empty. And that's one more piece in the puzzle that would tell us that it's reasonable to think that Jesus really did die and that he really did rise again.